This is Good Books, Big Questions, bold, loving, and sensible conversations about faith. I'm Karen Stiller. My guest is Deborah Sáenz. She's an editor for NavPress, specializing in Christian nonfiction. Here's our conversation unabridged. Welcome, Deborah.
Thank you, Karen. Thanks so much for having me.
Now, I confess I was oddly nervous about interviewing my own editor. I'm afraid me no speak right.
You have nothing to worry about. Don't worry.
Editors kind of make writers antsy, I think.
Yeah, I've heard that before. I've heard people say, I'm nervous to send you a text message. I have a friend who told me that. She'll send me a text message and say, I'm sorry, I did not include proper punctuation in this. I'm like,
oh, that's so funny. But do you see mistakes? Like, are your eagle eyes always open?
I think so.
Yeah, that's funny. So she's right to be nervous.
A little, well, when it comes to friends and family, I'm not like that, but definitely when I'm reading anything online or when I'm reading things on social media or, my eye kind of catches.
Yeah. Well, I will say, as my editor for Holiness here, you were very gentle and kind. So I did not experience you as mean.
I'm very glad to hear that. I try not to be.
So I do wonder, though, like what it's like for you as a book editor, because you're working with writers in this magical moment, probably for them, right? I know it was for me. Book deal, like this dream is coming true. I'm doing this work. And then we need to be critiqued and we need to do revision. And sometimes there's big, big changes that need to be made. And as a magazine editor, I sort of have this line I use with writers and to myself, which is don't be a big baby. So are writers big babies, Deborah? And how do you navigate that?
Oh, that's such a good question. It's so different depending on the author and the project. I have had such a great experience so far with my time as an editor at NavPress. I've been here for just a little over 4 years now. And this was my first acquisitions and development job. So my experience before this was in marketing for books. But I always wanted to be an editor, and I knew I had an eye for like good editorial instincts. So when I started, I was nervous. It's pretty vulnerable being an editor too, just like it is for writers. I hear when they submit their first draft to their editor, they get nervous. Well, it's kind of similar for a developmental editor when we're getting ready to send that first edit.
Okay.
Like I hope they don't hate it, or I hope they don't think I'm trying to, change their book baby, too much. But I've had such a good experience. Nobody yet has come back and told me, how dare you want to change my work? I haven't had that experience. Something that's kind of interesting about Christian book publishing is that a lot of the authors are not professional writers.
Okay. Yeah, tell me more.
A lot of our authors are practitioners. They're in Christian ministry, they're pastors, they're professors, sometimes academics, where they do a lot of speaking, so they're more speakers than they are writers,
Which are two very different things.
It is, yes.
Yeah.
Writing a sermon is very different than writing a book,
Mm-hmm.
I've worked, just several projects I've worked on recently, the authors are pastors, and it's so obvious when I'm reading through their first draft, like this sounds like a really great sermon.
Right.
But it's not quite working right now for print, and that's how I view my job. My job is to just help them, polish up their writing so that it's going to be effective in print form, in book form, And
Let's tell people exactly what acquisitions and developmental editing is then, in case they don't know. So as an acquisitions editor, you're receiving pitches and looking at fresh stuff?
that's right. Yes, I receive book proposals from literary agents every week, get new proposals. And it's also kind of my job to be on the lookout generally, in the industry, who is out there speaking on topics that we find interesting, compelling. We go to conferences sometimes in our acquisitions role to kind of see who's out there doing what and who's speaking about what, So it's kind of my job. It's our job as acquisitions editors to be on the lookout for people who are contributing interesting and compelling, just they're what am I trying to say? I guess I'm trying to say that they're contributing interesting things to the church. They're engaging in compelling conversations. And when we find somebody who is writing or speaking about something that we think would be a good fit for NavPress, that would be my job to start a conversation with them and see if they have a book in them, And so some of our projects do come from agents, and some don't have agents. We just kind of acquired them organically, and so two very different skill sets. The acquisitions part is kind of wooing an author, trying to get them to want to publish with us, and then negotiating a contract with them. And then the developmental editing phase is receiving their first draft, ensuring that it is what we thought it was going to be, and helping them to shape it and develop it into what will become the book. So making sure that it has the proper structure, that the organization makes sense, the chapters are in the right order, it has everything it needs, right? Like the right foreword or afterword, or table of contents makes sense and all that stuff.
So it's the big kind of renovation stage of writing.
Yeah, it is. It's like I usually call it like the big picture edit. So sometimes when I tell people I'm an editor, they assume it's grammar and spelling and commas, making sure all those details are correct. But that's actually not my job. That's the copy editor's job. Although I can do that if I want to, but usually I don't because it takes too much time.
Yeah, that is my nitpicky work.
Yeah, exactly.
You mentioned asking someone if they have a book in them. And there is that idea out there, this, saying I've heard that, everyone has a book in them. Mm-hmm. So I'm going to really put you on the hot seat. Do you think that's true?
I would not say that everyone has a book in them necessarily. I think everybody has a story to tell.
Oh, I like that.
I think that's true. But that's not necessarily going to be a book.
Yeah.
Yeah. Sometimes it might be that person needs to tell their story in other ways. Sometimes people are active on social media sharing their voice, or they feel the calling to do maybe a podcast or, speak in other contexts. Yeah, so everyone has a story to tell, but it's not always going to be a book. Sometimes it's just not the right medium.
Yeah. I am interested in what are your favorite kinds of stories to tell, or what stories do you particularly watch out for now at this stage in your editing career?
Yes. Well, I'm kind of a nerd. I really love books and topics that are just interesting and kind of cerebral. I like thinking about faith and what it means for our lives. And I think I'm always looking for ideas that are exploring faith at the intersection of culture, like something else, like faith and how faith interacts with the culture we live in, with our society, what it means for us in our day-to-day lives. I've worked on a few books that have to do with like faith and mental health and how those two things interact. I've worked on a book from a journalist, who traveled around the world interviewing single people in different faith traditions. I've edited books by pastors who are kind of looking at how the church has changed in the last 10 years and what we have to do to change the way we do church so that we are, I don't know. I think what I'm trying to say is that I like books that have something new to contribute, and that are coming from unique perspectives that we haven't heard before, or they're just telling their stories in a different way that hasn't been told.
So on your journey to becoming an editor, were there books that shaped you and influenced you and sort of pushed you in that direction for your career?
Ooh, so are you asking like books that shaped the way that I edit, or just books that influenced me to go into publishing?
That's what I'm asking.
Okay. Yeah. I think that when I was in college, I was involved in InterVarsity Christian Fellowship.
Okay.
And I read a lot of Christian books. When I was in college, I read a lot of InterVarsity Press books. And those were the first Christian books that I had read in my life. I grew up reading books, but not Christian books. So,
you know what, Deborah? Exactly the same with me. It was in university and it was IVP books. And they were the first Christian books I'd ever read. Yeah.
Look at that. Yeah. And they have some great books. And there were a few that influenced my life quite a bit. I didn't know at the time that I wanted to go into publishing. I had never actually thought about it. I think I didn't know enough about the book publishing industry. I didn't really know how to get into it. I just had a lot of misconceptions. I think a lot of people don't know a lot about book publishing industry. So it never even entered my mind as a possibility, So, but I did read quite a few books that influenced my faith in, it kind of set me on a trajectory. I was reading, I was studying communications, sociology, anthropology. I was learning about culture, race, ethnicity in those contexts in the classroom. And then I was also learning and growing more in my faith, and I was struggling a little bit to know how to reconcile those things. I'm Mexican American, grew up in Laredo, Texas, which is a border town in the Texas-Mexico border. Kind of grew up in that context with a pretty strong ethnic identity, but I didn't know how that tied into my Christian identity. I didn't know what exactly it meant, or how, or if I was supposed to keep those two things separate or join them together. So anyway, some of those books I read in college, one of them was Being Latino in Christ, which was an IVP book by Orlando Crystal. And that was like a paradigm shift for me, because it gave me language to describe how my ethnic identity is actually important in God's eyes, and I realized I do not need to keep these two identities separate. I shouldn't be, right? Then I also read quite a few books about faith and social justice and community development and the difference between personal sin and systemic and structural sin and things like that I had never heard before in my life. So those kinds of books really shaped my thinking.
Wow.
And when I finally realized that I wanted to go into publishing, this was a few years after I had graduated from college, I realized I want to work on those kinds of books.
Okay.
I want to work on books that are going to be, that are going to help change the way people think, and influence the way they live in real, like day-to-day kinds of ways. And so, yeah, my first job in publishing was actually with University Press, and I worked there for 8.5 years before coming to NavPress. And it made a lot of sense because it was a way for me to combine my interests and my passions and my faith with also like what I studied in college. You know, I studied communications and minored in anthropology. And book publishing was a great way for me to join those two things and be able to use my skills. And my work now is very meaningful.
Is it a special joy for you to work with a writer of color and bringing their story into the world? And why is that so important?
It's definitely important to me. I think when I started working in book publishing, I didn't realize how white it is. You know,
Yeah.
I didn't realize, just especially because I really enjoyed reading authors of color. And then when I started working in that environment, I realized just how, you know, historically the industry has been very white. And so it kind of quickly became a passion of mine to work with as many authors of color as I could to help make them feel welcome and understood. I know how important it is when you see yourself represented, you know? So for an author of color to have an editor of color, or their marketing person is also a person of color, or, you know, just to be able to work with somebody who understands your perspective, it's very important. So I've had the opportunity to acquire several authors of color, and it's been such a joy. Like, it feels like such an honor and privilege to be able to help give somebody a platform to share their voice and share their story, and to be able to work with them in the editing process and help them kind of polish up or sharpen their writing. And editing is so fun because, you know, most authors are very appreciative of their editors, you know, so it's nice to be able to develop a relationship with them like that. So yeah. Does that answer the question?
Yeah, I think so. Absolutely. And as you were speaking about the fun and the joy of it, and the importance of bringing, you know, a bunch of different stories to the world, I was thinking how amazing it is. And I've experienced this in a very small way, I think, with like article editing in my magazine past, to bring something into the world that is new and that wouldn't have existed otherwise, maybe. And that as an editor, you're collaborating, but you're kind of invisible, you know, in the end. And it's just partnering with someone and, you know, helping them find their voice and bringing this really important story out. So it is great.
Definitely. Yeah, that's exactly how I see it. And it is an honor to be able to do this kind of work.
Yeah. I'm curious about readers because I have the impression, and in my experience, men are less eager to read books by women. And in your experience, does the same thing happen with different ethnic groups?
Oh, that's really interesting. That's a good question. You said, are they less eager? I don't necessarily see it that way. I just think that sometimes readers don't often think about wanting to read a book from somebody else's perspective. We tend to want to read books that we're going to resonate with and identify with, and sometimes that just tends to be authors who are like us and who have stories like us, and we know we're going to resonate with their words. Something that I talk about a lot is how readers should be intentional about reading books from people of different ethnicities, because that's the only way, that's one of the ways, I guess, we're going to learn. We're going to learn about other people's experiences in life, experiences in the church. It's really important, I think, for our own spiritual formation. And I don't think it's that people don't want to do it. I just think sometimes they don't think about it.
Right.
I've heard stories of people, somebody encouraging somebody else to look at their bookshelves and figure out how many books are on your bookshelf that are from white men in general, then women, then ethnic minorities. And people go into it thinking, oh yeah, I'm sure I have people, authors on my shelves. And then they go in and they look and they realize, oh wow, I did not realize that 95% of the books on my shelves are actually white men. Like, they thought that it was going to be more diverse. They thought it must be, but then they actually go in and look and they realize it's not. It's not something that they did intentionally. It's just that over the course of our lives, or, some people's lives, they just tend to pick up books that by people who are like them, So I think that's one of the reasons why it's important to talk to people about being more intentional about who you're reading. And if people do it, if they do read outside of their ethnicity, they're going to be greatly blessed by it.
I love that idea of doing a bookcase inventory. And, it's fun for those of us who love books to dig into our bookcases. So that really gives a purpose to it. I love that idea, and I'm going to do that.
Yeah.
The publishing industry in general, like, there's been all kinds of surveys and reports and, reveal that it is heavily white weighted, or certainly was. I sense that's starting to change. Is that starting to change in the Christian publishing industry as well?
I think it is. I think it has been changing for the better over the last, maybe the last decade, but definitely the last 5 years or so. I have seen changes in the right direction. There was an interesting cultural moment right around 2020, right around the death of George Floyd, when a lot of publishers started responding to these kind of industry-wide calls for greater diversity and inclusivity, both in their hiring and also in the book content. And this was, we kind of saw a surge in publications by Black authors, Indigenous authors, Asian, Latino authors. And I think there was this really strong surge that lasted for maybe a year, 2 years, maybe. And then I think it kind of died down a little bit, It was kind of like real hot at the moment. And I remember when that happened, I remember thinking, oh man, like I hope this isn't just a fad, like publishers are just doing this because it's the cool thing to do right now. I hope it continues. And it hasn't continued quite at that rate, but I'm still glad that it happened. I still think that it was necessary, this kind of reckoning, industry-wide reckoning. Lots of conversations about systemic racism, and there was a lot of pressure on this industry to address its own practices. So anyway, I think all of that is very good, but I think we still have a long way to go. I have seen in Christian publishing, I think some publishing houses have done a better job than others, but I think that, we're members of the ECPA, the Evangelical Christian Publishing Association, and they've had several diversity initiatives over the last, probably 5 years or more, where they are encouraging its members to increase diversity in their own houses. They have initiatives throughout the ECPA that are focusing on increasing diversity. There's this Publishing in Color conference that happens every year. That's also a Christian, specifically in the Christian industry, trying to help more authors of color understand book publishing. And I think that's been really good. So there's a few things like that I think has been really helpful. And I hope it continues, because I think we still have a lot of room to grow,
Yeah.
One thing I'd really like to see is more books being written by authors of color that are not just about race and ethnicity. We need to see more books about all kinds of topics, books by authors of color on prayer and spiritual formation and marriage and parenting and just topics like that, instead of feeling like those authors can only speak about one or two topics.
Talk to me about fiction and nonfiction. Like in my own reading life a few years ago, as Canada, where I'm at, has reckoned with our history with First Nations people, I set out on a fiction reading adventure where I was reading fiction by Indigenous writers. I love novels. I think fiction is just as important as nonfiction, and I really learn from novels. So that was my intention, and I think it really did help me. And I'm wondering about that distinction for you. Can fiction do the work that nonfiction can do?
Yes, that's a really good question. I think so. I think, yeah, I think sometimes stories are better told when they're done in fiction. There's a need for both, fiction and nonfiction. I will admit I didn't really read a lot of Christian nonfiction. I've always loved fiction in general, but I didn't really read a lot of Christian nonfiction up until recently.
Or do you mean Christian novels, like Christian fiction?
I meant to say Christian fiction.
Yeah. I get that. I completely understand.
I think some of the first Christian books, like I was telling you before, some of the first Christian books I read were nonfiction, and those had such an impact on my life that I just kind of kept reading nonfiction and didn't really think about Christian nonfiction. I did it again, Farron. I'm so sorry. Oh my goodness. Didn't think much about Christian fiction. But then a few years ago, I was invited to be a judge for the ECPA's. They have, they do Christian Book Awards every year, and they have a special category for fiction books by authors of color.
Okay.
And I was a judge for it, so I got a stack of like 8 fiction novels in the mail, and I had such a great time reading through those. And at first I thought, like, what are these going to be about? How is this? Because I just didn't have a lot of experience with Christian fiction, and now I kind of love it.
So good. That's really cool.
I try to make it a point to pick up a few, of those books every year. And I think that is a really important way for authors to, they can share their own stories through these novels, I think some people learn better that way too. Some people learn
I agree.
when reading about it through novels than reading a nonfiction book.
You are Roman Catholic, and I found that out as I was working through the process with NavPress, and they told me, who my editor would be, and she's Catholic. And I was really relieved I thought that will be a good thing. I assumed that you would understand the Anglicanism that can run through my book, which you told me to, make sure I didn't only talk about that. And that was a great developmental correction for me. And so I felt safe with you because I knew you were Catholic. And I'm wondering how that part of your identity impacts your editing and your work.
I'm so glad to hear you say that because, I've worked in evangelical Christian publishing my whole career, and I myself have gone, my faith background is kind of varied. Like I grew up Catholic, and then I started going to a non-Catholic, like an evangelical Christian church when I was in high school, and continued for 10, maybe 15 years, and then made a decision to go back to the Catholic Church when I had my children. So I have experience with different faith traditions, even though I currently call the Catholic Church home. I still have an understanding of different faith traditions, and I appreciate a lot of different traditions for the uniquenesses that they bring. I think no tradition is perfect. And I think that has been really good for me as an editor, as I work with different authors of all different kinds of Christian faith traditions. I can kind of step into their world and understand them, but also bring my unique perspective. So I think it makes it a little bit easier for me to catch things that maybe that are insensitive to other traditions, or when, maybe an author is telling a story that I don't think represents a certain tradition very well, or something like that. Like I can speak to that in a way, in an informed way. I have had authors who write, tell stories about Catholics or other denominations, and they ask me in the notes, is it okay that I tell this story? Is it okay with NavPress? Because they're not sure, they're really not sure if it's okay for them to say certain things. And so that's always kind of fun when I come back and tell them, yes, that's okay. I'm Catholic. And they'll be like, oh, you are? Oh, that's good to hear. I didn't know that. I didn't know that, So sometimes it's surprising to some people. But I do think that, I think that it's a part of me. And as an editor, and, I've been my boss, the publisher of NavPress has told me before, he wants for me and for everyone on the team to feel like we can bring our whole selves to our job and not feel like we have to leave anything at the door. And I really appreciate that.
Yeah, that's beautiful. What can we expect and if you can project forward, and I know I'm putting you on the spot here, but from NavPress in the next few years, do you think? Is there a new direction? Are we just, what are you excited about? How's that?
Wow. I think that, NavPress has kind of evolved quite a bit in the last 10 years. I've only been around for 4 of those. But, I think, first of all, just in the last 5 years or so, I think NavPress has published, the amount of resources we've published by authors of color has gone up significantly. And that's been, and that was intentional, like we that was a part of the vision. That is one direction that we really wanted to head in. So to see that actually happening has been very encouraging. And I think that will continue. Not just authors of color, but books that represent diverse perspectives. I think that I hope to see us continue on a trajectory that where we're not afraid to push on the limits, just on our limits a little bit. Be bold in the things that we're publishing, which is a part of our tagline now, which is pretty cool. That's actually something that happened just recently in the last year, where we adopted this new tagline, bold, loving, sensible, and I think it represents us really well. And I think that it's encouraging to hear authors, as we had our 50th anniversary this past year, NavPress turned 50 years old, and we received some videos from authors just kind of encouraging us, and to hear them say comments along those lines that this tagline makes sense for NavPress because it represents the books that they have historically done and also the direction in which they're moving. So hearing that from authors is really encouraging, and I hope that we can continue in that direction.
Oh, beautiful. Well, you have provided the perfect segue to our closing question, which is built around that bold, sensible, loving tagline that works so well. And those are the kind of conversations we're trying to have on this podcast. And I think we did that, Deborah. So thank you for that. Where could you be more bold?
Or can I be more bold? In so many areas, Karen. But I think over the last couple years, at least in my personal life, I've been trying to be more bold in setting boundaries for myself, both in my personal life and just and work too, not being so afraid of what other people are going to think about me, not being so afraid of other people's perceptions, but being true to who I am as a person and what I believe. Sometimes it's scary, but I think it gets easier as you get older.
Mm-hmm.
There's something about getting older that just kind of makes you care a little bit less about what other people are thinking. And that's something that I've been trying to do myself.
Nice. That is the fun part of getting a little older, I think. I love that. The second question in this closing set is, what is the most sensible advice your parents, or it could be a friend, has given you?
I think that would be trust your instincts. I mean, it's so simple. And it makes a lot of sense. But for me, at least personally, it hasn't always come super naturally. I don't know why that is. I think there's something about sometimes we have a fear of, or maybe it's a fight between our brain and our hearts. In my experience, I have felt that. I think something, but then I feel something, and there's kind of a battle, and in situations where I'm not really sure what to do, I question my instincts. And that's also something that has changed for me, at least in the last few years. As I think I'm getting older, I think about that advice quite a bit. It's something that my parents have always told me, and I think, and I've heard it from friends too. Just trust your gut, trust your instincts. And there was a point where I would ask myself, I don't know if I can trust myself. And I'm starting to realize, yes, I definitely can. I just need to be able to tune into that more easily and not question it, Just have faith that maybe that is the Holy Spirit speaking through my, through what I'm feeling inside my gut. If that makes sense.
It does. It makes very good sense. And finally, when or where have you grown most in love?
The first thing that comes to mind is through my children, I think. You know, having children or just being responsible for little people in general, is kind of a scary thing. I think I realized after I had my first child, I realized I had never really experienced that kind of love before, and it was kind of a scary love. It was the first time I had ever felt scared, like if something were to happen to this little person, I don't know what I would do with myself, And to feel that kind of love for somebody is scary, but it's also really beautiful. And it kind of forces us to just kind of let go of our fears and live in the moment.
Yeah.
And there are other ways to feel that. It's not just, I think just for me, having kids is kind of what did it. It really forced me to grow in love in ways that I never thought that I could.
Yeah, it's a game changer.
Yeah.
Our readers are our friends, and I know you feel that way, and conversation partners with us. Can you offer our listeners a blessing as they read whatever it is they are reading, and maybe something you've edited, Deborah?
Oh, sure. Okay. Here we go. May your hearts be open and your mind be discerning as you read. May the words not only inform your life, but transform your soul. Let what you read inspire action in this divisive world that we live in.
Amen. Thank you.
Welcome.